So we wanted to go just a step further, and we said, well, if you were to define your assets as a North Country resident, what would those assets be? And the most common and frequently mentioned response was our family and our neighbors. They were seen as the assets. Now, people do not judge people based on what they own in the North Country. People are judged by who they are and how they are with others. And that's an important dimension to be aware of. Most people also said that they eventually wanted to return to the North Country to raise their children. And we do see that phenomenon. There's not a great deal of opportunity for young people in the North Country, and often they leave the area to pursue their careers. But we see families returning when it's time to raise children, and they want the children to experience that closeness of community and closeness of family that they experienced. That sense of survival leads to a spirit of longevity in the North Country. People remain independent well into their old age. I have a neighbor who's 92 years old. She still cooks on a wood-fired stove. About 10 years ago, her children wanted to remodel her kitchen for her. And she said, that's fine, you can do what you want, but don't touch my stove. I've been cooking on it for the past 70 years, and I'll cook on it till I die. And hauling wood is not unfamiliar to this 90-some-year-old woman. And that's not an unusual characteristic in the North Country. You'll see that often. Last, we asked people, what do you see as your greatest challenges? And again, things that people previously had identified as assets were now defined as some of their challenges. One of them was isolation, and particularly when it comes to accessing services. Medical care is a fine example. It's not often in the backyard. We have to travel great distances to receive appropriate medical care. And the distance and the geography and the climate tend to make us isolated, and it's difficult to often access what we need. Low wages are considered a major issue in the North Country. Economic development is an enormous challenge. We live in a region where the interstates stop in Littleton. There's still a great deal of the North Country beyond the interstate. There's no infrastructure for transporting products and services. The technology infrastructure has its limitations. There's still parts of the region with no broadband access. Those are real issues that limit the economic development in the North Country, and they really need to be challenged in a very consistent manner. Another challenge of North Country folks is that they do not transition well, and that's a self-proclaimed issue. It's not one that we're defining. Remember, the survey was based on how people see themselves. And folks often mention feeling out of place when they go to an urban area, and feeling intimidated, and are very anxious to get back to the North Country. Another challenge was overcoming the perceptions that Southern people have of North Country residents. North Country residents have a perception that they're sometimes judged as country bumpkins and somehow not as intelligent or as sophisticated as their peers in the southern part of the state. And while we know absolutely that's not true, it's a perception that folks hold of themselves, and that presents some real challenges. Now, so given all of those things that North Country folks say about themselves, what are some of the implications for service? One of the things that we found in Care New Hampshire many, many years ago is that if we were really to move services forward and be able to effectively impact the lives, it meant forming relationships with the very folks that we serve. Interesting phenomenon, because in our professional training we are taught to maintain a certain level of professional distance and to maintain a strong sense of confidentiality. And while that's true, now we also need to figure out how to develop relationships. When we were doing Care in New Hampshire, one of the issues that was an enormous challenge was figuring out ways to foster that relationship between clinical mental health practitioners and the families they were serving. And there was a great deal of trepidation on both sides of the fence, and we were looking for ways to break that down. Sometimes we found the assets of the North Country as ways of doing that. Now, people in the North Country like to play. They like to play in the natural environment. Thus the name, live, learn, and play. So we at one point brought together all the service providers and the families for an outing at a local lake. And as can well be imagined, the providers sat together and the families sat together, and there was a bit of distance between the two. But we had a plan in mind. And about 10 minutes into the event, we brought out the water blasters and started soaking people down. And some were annoyed and some fled. But it didn't take long for everybody to get into the spirit of the water battle. We found that being in bathing suits and being soaking wet immediately broke down a lot of barriers. And within a half an hour, the groupings were reconfigured and people were openly sharing stories about each other's lives. So that relationship is very important, and it can break down many, many barriers. Another consideration is that we need to be flexible in the times that we provide our services. Remember what we're saying about the economy of the North Country. It shifted from manufacturing to service, so wages tend to be lower. People can't afford to lose wages. Also remember, we have that concept of patchworking, families working many jobs. So the times that we offer our services have to meet the times that are available to the clients. In my own practice, if I have a client coming from Colebrook to my office in Littleton for clinical intervention, we're talking 1.5 to 2 hours travel time each way. Now, for a 1-hour appointment, that could potentially mean a loss of 5 hours wages. Now, we need to figure out how to be more flexible in meeting clients on their time. One of the things we also found was we need to teach people resiliency. The dance of becoming healthy or becoming emotionally stable is sometimes 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. We're dealing with people who sometimes feel disadvantaged and overwhelmed. and the setbacks can sometimes be perhaps more overwhelming. And so we need to teach resiliency and help people understand that despite those temporary setbacks, they can move forward. Now, because the North Country lacks privacy at times, and we talked about how people seem to know each other a great deal. Now, families that are struggling sometimes bear a sense of shame, and that sense of shame causes them to self-isolate. We particularly see this with families having children with severe emotional disturbance. Now, when a child's behavior is very disruptive, the family will withdraw. And yet we said those connections with people are one of the greatest resources. So we've got to help destigmatize, particularly mental health issues, and help people, again, develop resiliency. We know that cultural clashes will sometimes occur, and we just have to be willing to talk about them and work our way through them when they do surface. Now, if a provider is coming from outside of the area, it's important to work hard and learn the culture. And again, the best way to do that is through relationships. Now, we need to recognize and respect the privacy that people want, and so that's a two-edged sword. And I can hear you saying, you're saying we've got to form relationships, but we've got to respect privacy. Now, think of the relationship of a couple. In a marriage relationship, there's always a need for strong relationship and intimacy, but there's also a need for privacy. And the North Country culture is very much like that. There's a desire for intimacy, but there's some things that need to be held in private. And so it's finding that delicate balance. Now, as providers, we need to reach beyond assumptions. And as I talk specifically about the culture of poverty, I think you'll understand what we mean by that a little bit more. And we need to balance the contradictions between our identified cultures and our perceptions. Sometimes the perception we have of a culture is not the same as the culture itself. And so we need to constantly be asking ourselves the questions of, is this what the North Country is really like? Or is this my perception of the North Country? And the best way to find out is to ask. People are willing to share who they are. And last but not least, if you truly want to function in the North Country, you need to celebrate who North Country people are, because they're wonderful folks, and you'll enjoy your time here if you're able to do that.